Good morning, everybody. I'm John Mankowski. I'm the coordinator for the North Pacific LCC, and welcome to this webinar. We try to sponsor these monthly, but sometimes it's a little less than monthly, but really it's a chance to highlight for our partners some key work that we funded or that our partners are doing throughout the region. We advertise these broadly, and we really try to make sure that these are high-quality presentations and an educational experience for you. I am going to introduce Tina here in a minute, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we funded this project in particular and why it's important to the NPLCC partners. There's really three reasons. One is this is a very unique ecosystem. The islands in San Juan County, depending on the tide level, when you count them, there's over 400 islands. And as we all know, island geographies are very unique and very sensitive to landscape scale stressors like sea level rise. The second reason we're excited to fund this is this really bridges the gap between science and management. The real key topic here that we were trying to get at was making use of sea level rise information and adaptation, vulnerability assessments, but really to get it in the hands of managers, land use landowners, land use regulators, and others so that they can understand how to incorporate this information into their work, so we're actually doing something about these landscape scale stressors instead of just talking about them. And lastly, I think this has broad applications. Sea level rise is affecting the North Pacific LCC coastline variably from Alaska down to California, but the approach that was taken by Tina Whitman and her organization really can be applied anyway, so we're excited to hear her results. Tina Whitman is the Science Director for Friends of San Juans. She has a lot of experience in marine ecosystem recovery. She's worked in the Pacific Northwest for many, many years, and she's helping lead this really, really active NGO called Friends of San Juans. And I will not delay any longer and ask that Tina go ahead and take over and present your information.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Megan. And thanks to the NPLCC for the funding, obviously, for the project and also for the opportunity to present today. My co-presenter, Andrea McLennan, had a family emergency, so she will not be online with us today. Unfortunately, I will be presenting her material, and there'll be information at the end on how to contact her directly, and she encourages that. But she was the lead scientist on the sea level rise vulnerability model. So I'll start by providing some overall project context, because this was a large multi-year project. And then we'll talk briefly about the sea level rise vulnerability assessment, moving into some decision support tools that we developed for managers and property owners to help them, again, as John talked about, actually apply the results of the vulnerability assessment. And then I'll wrap up with kind of an overview and some of the results of our outreach engagement efforts. So I will jump right in. Just a little background. Again, I'm the sole presenter today, but not the sole person involved in this project. We had a lot of formal partners, we had formal funders, and we were also, the majority of the work was driven heavily advised by a technical advisory team where we had county, state, federal, and tribal representation. And John gave a little context of the San Juans, and I think it is important to sort of think about the place that we're doing this project, because it's sort of why we chose this project. It's where I live and work, but it also, I think, provides some unique opportunities to look at sea level rise adaptation. So we have over 400 miles of marine shoreline, very diverse shoreline types. We have every shoreline type except large river deltas. We have high ecosystem services, so there's a lot of intact habitat here that's contributing locally and regionally to the marine environment. And because we're predominantly non-urban, we're not limited by some of the constraints that other adaptation approaches might be, say, in an urban downtown Seattle kind of way. We also have, because of these different kinds of shores, we are at risk from flood and erosion hazards from sea level rise, so it allowed us to explore both of those. So for that combination of reasons, we really felt like this is a good place to develop and explore adaptation approaches. So this slide tries to put the whole project into context. So a few years ago, we started with a real heavy new research focus, and this was work funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and they funded the sea level rise vulnerability model. So the things that are sort of highlighted in yellow are what I'm going to talk about today. But at the same time, we also did a regulatory and policy review of what are the existing laws and how do they work to address sea level rise. And then we also did some new research on forage fish, looking at their vulnerability to sea level rise. So I just want people to be aware of those elements. I'm not going to talk about them today, but the links that I'll provide at the end, all these reports are available online, and I'm happy to talk with people later about those elements. So this new research really fed into manager outreach, and we did a lot of different things with that, interviews, focus groups, and we worked with local and regional managers. And then kind of our results of our manager outreach and our research has really led us to our more recent work over the last year, where we're really starting to work with shoreline property owners and vulnerable communities, providing them information, but also collecting information from them. And kind of the end game here, where we're not really there yet, is implementing on-the-ground adaptation projects, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the end because we do have some moving along, and also obviously leading to improved policy would be the overall goal. And with that, I will skip or transition talking about the vulnerability model. Again, I'm wearing Andrea's hat today. She was the lead scientist on that, so really the gory detailed technical questions you can save for her, but I was involved in a lot of aspects, so the broader questions I can certainly answer. So gaining public awareness and providing technical resources are really first steps towards adaptation. And for this project, we developed a series of tools to help managers and property owners better understand the range and sources of vulnerability on their properties and also how to identify. And this slide here, this presentation will sort of follow these three main areas: how will my shoreline respond, how vulnerable, that gets at the vulnerability assessment, and then thinking about what are the appropriate adaptation responses. So fundamental to our approach is that different shore forms will respond differently to different threats and implications of climate change, and that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to solutions. Again, this gets back at why San Juan is such a great model for this, because we have so many of these different shoreline types to explore. So first, we must help managers and property owners understand what is along the shoreline, what type of shore it is. Then again, looking at the vulnerability model, understanding the level of the threat. And with those fundamentals, we can then explore what are the appropriate adaptation responses. So in San Juan County, again, we have almost all the shoreline types and a huge variability in these shore types, even within parcels. This map here is showing all the different shorelines. I think most folks always just assume that we're all bedrock up here, and while we do have 250 miles of bedrock, we have over 150 miles of non-bedrock shores, which are obviously susceptible to rising sea levels. And then there's also the presence of drift cells, pocket beaches that aren't in drift cells, and different constraints with each site, such as the level of development, infrastructure, things like that. So these are sort of the framework for how we talk about how shore forms will respond. And as many of you know, again, the implications of sea level rise are different based on these shore forms, but there's sort of these basic principles, which is sort of where we start the framework of talking about the shore form response. So looking at increases of water levels, increased erosion, a natural shoreline, if it has the ability to, will move landward. We'll have more frequent high water events, and we also do expect habitat loss of armored shores via the coastal squeeze. So as part of this project, again, there's such a focus on communicating the results, and this really came about when we had our technical team and we started looking at the results of this vulnerability model. And then we also think about some of our goals for reducing demand for new armor and trying to restore natural shorelines, is there's really a natural tension there. And we really felt like that the rollout of this, that it wasn't good enough to sort of just do a vulnerability model and just sort of plop it on the web for people to sort of do what they would with it, was that we really needed sort of a deliberate, thoughtful communication strategy to go along with the model for managers and for property owners. Now, some of the regional managers obviously have a lot more expertise in these topics, but at the county scale, where a lot of these decisions are made, there's not a lot of expertise in terms of scientific expertise, and particularly keeping up with the topic of sea level rise. So these next few slides are just showing some of the example graphics, really simple, kind of cartoony, but again, to try to show, instead of just talk about, how things might respond. So again, we have a lot of bedrock shores in San Juan County, so that is an example of how that would respond with just a shift of intertidal habitats. Also a graphic for bluff, really trying to get people to understand that the entire beach profile, not just, the water level is not just going to come up. The beach is actually going to adjust landward. Barrier beaches, again, having some images to show folks that if there's room and adequate sediment supply, your barrier beach will migrate. They do this already, depending on storms and some of the sea level rise we've already seen. But again, that kind of illustrates the fact that you've got to have more space landward. And then looking at artificial shores and helping folks understand how, what that coastal squeeze is and how that habitat, such as forage fish habitat, may get narrowed or squeezed. So that's sort of the first set of kind of communication tools that we developed thinking about shore form response. Now I'll briefly describe the sea level rise vulnerability assessment. It's a very complicated study, and that we definitely don't have time to talk about the details of it today. And so again, I would encourage folks to follow up with Andrea or myself, and also the full report, which is about 150 pages, is available online. And very soon, coming early in 2016, you'll also be able to download the geodatabase on our website and likely on the NPLCC website as well. So our sea level rise assessment for the county was a landscape scale, and we were looking at integrating bluff erosion and inundation, so not just doing a bathtub model. And being a community of islands, we do have a lot of infrastructure in close proximity to the shoreline. And the idea of this planning tool was really to have it be helpful to really link to future projects and management strategies. So again, not just providing the science, but actually sort of help get to some of the management recommendations. So again, this was the phase that was most heavily guided by the technical advisory team, and our starting point was selecting the appropriate sea level rise projections and planning horizons. And here you can see from the National Research Council, this is what we adopted. Our work was done before the latest IPCC report, so this is the numbers we used. So we looked at a moderate and a high, and then also a sort of a shorter and longer term time horizon. So using these projections and planning horizons, we then developed a simple bathtub model using VDatum and LiDAR topography. And when we did the bathtub model, we decided to add the projections to the highest observed water level rather than the mean high water level, which is regularly inundated. Because the Howell is still a still water level, and we don't have wave run-up data in our model due to data limitations, so this was sort of our attempt to kind of capture some of those highest water events. So we're trying to be more inclusive rather than exclusive at this county-wide scale kind of assessment. Next, we measured background erosion rates from a stratified sample of shore types throughout the county, including feeder bluffs, transport zones, pocket beaches, and accretion shore forms, or barrier beaches. We did not do this for bedrock shores, obviously. And then we stratified these by shore orientation and exposure category, and these historic erosion rates were measured in GIS using the digital shoreline analysis systems, and also relying on historic vertical air photos from the 1960s through 2009. And this also included some very site-specific data. A few of these sites have real long-term data sets, but the majority of them it was done with vertical air photos. And I will note here, so this is great information for how we incorporate erosion into a sea level rise vulnerability model. This is also useful information for folks who are either designing or evaluating or identifying restoration opportunities or potential soft shore versus hard armor opportunities, because this gives us a picture of what erosion rates actually are on the ground for a subset of sites across our county. Next, the position of the bluff crest was digitized from LiDAR data. So this is how we get into the erosion, not flooding aspect of the model. And then we buffered the future erosion based on shore type and exposure, what our sea level rise projection scenario was, so that medium high, and the planning horizons 2050 and 2100. So as you can see in the image here, again, kind of a useful graphic to help managers grasp the concept, and landowners especially, that this landward recession of the bluff crest will continue, and it'll actually accelerate with the additional rise in sea level rise. The exact rate of the bluff recession that was expected to increase that we used in our model, we adopted from peer review science, and it was the SCAPE model, the Soft Cliff and Platform Evaluation Model, which is Ashton 2013, and that is in our report too if people want to look that up. And then we created polygons from these bluff buffers to select the roads and structures at risk. Again, this bluff crest is another sort of intermediate data layer that feeds into this model, but it also has a lot of real-world planning applications in terms of citing setbacks or as a baseline for measuring future change. It is important to keep in mind, so you get all these fancy maps, and they look very site-specific and perfect, but it's a countywide assessment, and like all sea level rise work is based on projections and assumptions, and so it's not available or not appropriate to really try to predict change at the parcel scale. It's really a course-level tool to help us develop appropriate management strategies. The NPLCC grant funded a detailed error analysis for the study, and that enabled us to calculate the cumulative error associated with the erosion rates and also to graphically display this. So in the geodatabase, the buffers are included and can actually be displayed with the mapping data. And it's important to note not all the drivers of change are accounted for in the model. I referenced earlier, that we just don't have wave data for the San Juans. And then there's obviously uncertainty in the rates of bluff retreat and sea level rise. We did our best to use the best published data and what we thought made the most sense for here, but those numbers obviously are subject to change. So next I'll just show a few examples of the maps of sort of what some of the results look like. The 2009 that's shown here is the highest observed water level. That was 3.1 feet higher than mean high water. And then you can see the different colors here, and they do layer on top of each other, so it's hard, it becomes like the green in that 250 or 2050, and the moderate projection is sort of under these other layers. So this is a map that combines the flood and erosion risk, so this is a kind of a combined risk map. The next map is just looking at roads vulnerable to flooding, and this is just one subset. One island, this is Shaw Island, if folks are familiar with the San Juans. And one point I should make about these maps is this whole tool really works better as a GIS tool than it does as a mapping exercise, as you can see by how pretty challenging, especially with all the islands and the 400 miles of shoreline. We flirted with the idea of doing map books, but you end up with just thousands of pages. So it's really, for folks that are interested and have access to GIS, it's really most useful to actually play around in the database. This map is showing places vulnerable just to erosion. So we're on feeder bluffs here. So again, you can sort of turn on just erosion. You could look at just the 2050 risk. You could look just at the longer term risk. So it really allows you to get a good sense of where the vulnerable areas are and what is the primary threat. So now that we know that, sort of what's the shore form, and then you can use the assessment as we just looked at to identify what is the threat and when is the threat, then you can use that information to talk about adaptation approaches and what would be appropriate. We provide some basic parameters that when we talk about this with managers and with landowners, just of the things you need to think about. Again, what's your time frame? What is the sort of value of the infrastructure of the development? Are we talking about $1 million trophy home? Or are we talking about a garden shed? You might end up with a very different adaptation approach. Are there maintenance costs? And then a piece that we're really interested in is what are the opportunities that might be associated with some of these adaptation strategies? Is there a habitat conservation or restoration opportunity? Could it increase resiliency of the system, which would help our natural and human communities? Are there public access opportunities? Sort of a whole host of other things that might come up at some of these sites, and really come up with a multi-benefit project. So to help people, again, sort of think about these adaptation approaches, same sort of similar cartoon schematic graphics. So going through each of some of the basics, so relocation, fortification, so I'll just kind of walk through these. And on these slides, we sort of highlight for folks, and I think this is really important when communicating with local managers especially, and also with property owners, is not every solution fits every risk. So relocation actually can be a good one because you do get away from things, and it could be expensive, but it might end up being, in the long run, cheaper than a highly engineered solution. I'll just go through a series of these again, talking about you could elevate things. This doesn't actually solve your erosion problem, just addresses flooding. Really trying to communicate on the limitations of shoreline armor. There was a lot of concern when we did this vulnerability model that we were going to actually help increase demand for armoring, and I think that's why we really tried to concentrate on taking a very thoughtful approach to rollout and communicating on the topic, and really trying to help frame the conversation in our community so that we can come up with some solutions that work for people and coastal processes. Again, looking at nourishment, highlighting how nourishment can be used in several different ways to increase resiliency and climate change adaptation, but that it's also rarely adequate on its own as a long-term approach. And then in addition to the graphics, there's this series of sort of super simple decision trees, which we did for each of the shore forms. I'm just going to show the bluff one here, but again, it shows you what are the appropriate tools? And next steps for us are really to think about integrating. We've mostly been using this in a presentation format, and we're playing around with how we could make this into either a brochure or something that's on the web that would be sort of a standalone. So again, there would be some of these graphics, some of these decision trees available to help folks. And I think again, highlighting some of these important parts, like where armor might be a short-term solution to bluff erosion, it's only going to address that erosion caused by wave energy, and a lot of our bluff erosion around here comes from intense, rain events, which we're having right now. I don't know if you guys are around the region as well. And I'm going to transition here. I think we'll do a break for questions after this first section, and then the next session will be a little shorter and be a conversation on some of our actual manager and landowner outreach. So now I'll talk a little bit about how we worked with managers and community members. Again, I mentioned this, that this step was really identified as critical instead of sort of just throwing this scary data out there. We really wanted to avoid being alarmist and also contributing to a run on new hard armoring. We did start our outreach efforts with managers. We really spent about a year working closely with local and regional managers before we went out to the broader community, so we got a lot of feedback on sort of how we present the information and what kind of information would be helpful when we get with the public. And then the intent here, and we're doing a little bit of already, is that our work with private landowners and community members will then feed back to managers, and I'll get back to that later, but I think it's going to be an important tool in how we actually advance some of the adaptation. There can be some inertia in our bureaucratic systems and also a short-term kind of horizon with elected officials and things, and I think having some real strong support from community members for some actions can help things. Again, looking at our funders, same sort of suite of funders, EPA, NPLCC, also Sustainable Path Foundation and Friends members. And this outreach phase was really Friends, Coastal Geologic Services, and then we worked closely with Resource Media, which is a nonprofit communications organization. We worked with their Seattle folks, but they work across the country on the topic of climate change communication. So we used a lot of scales. So again, we worked with regional managers, county managers. Today I'm going to focus a lot more on the community managers. I think most of you on the phone are our managers, and so it's not that interesting to sort of hear what your peers are thinking. But all of that information is available in the reports that are online. The manager data has all been summarized. And we did take I guess I would say a multi-pronged approach. So we did surveys, and we did interviews, and we did focus groups, and we worked one-on-one with specific departments, such as public works departments, and we had groups of our local conservation entities. And so I think that combination of kind of more informal and formal and large group and small group has provided us a pretty good picture. And that information from the managers, all that outreach, was used by our technical team, and they sort of combined that with the scientific research results in their development of the management recommendations. So again, a whole lot of manager outreach, lots of folks, all the usual suspects, kind of our agency, state, tribal managers, and then we had a real focus on county, because where a lot of these decisions get made, and particularly regarding our infrastructure, is at that local scale. So we worked closely. We had multiple workshops with our public works department, with planners, with managers, with their maintenance folks, with our planning department, and then also with local conservation entities to really get them thinking about, are there different ways they should be managing existing properties, and are there different properties or different kind of features they should actually be targeting in the future. And then switching to our community outreach, our broad-scale community outreach has included newsletter articles, also King Tide events. I'm sure most of you are familiar with those. They've been a great tool to engage the public on the topic. Every year we sort of get a larger response and more folks involved. We also now have other conservation organizations in the county helping collect photos and get people involved. And it's been a really great tool just in terms of sort of having better images for your presentations too, and having people really pick places that are sort of public spots. So in this picture, if you're not from Shaw Island, that rock, you just are not used to it. But for people who live there, so we're trying to find kind of those iconic places for people's local communities and really showing what the impacts of climate change may look like. So, and then a foundation of our outreach with vulnerable communities was a workshop format where we really tried to place sea level rise in a broader context of the local community and of shoreline management in a more general way. We had some new partners involved in this phase of the project, so we engaged with Washington Sea Grant. We felt it was really important to have the perception and have a real neutral party, kind of that neutral, credible outside party. They came and presented on the regional and sort of global sea level rise science, and they were also our facilitators for our survey portion, so that we were trying to not introduce any bias from some of us who live here or know some of the people or places in the pictures and all those things. We used a real community sort of format style to make it more fun or feel less like people being talked at and more like people were engaged and participating. So we had a community lunch, food from local farmers, food from the local community. We kicked off with a sort of, here's your local shoreline, here's all these boat ramps you have, and how many public beaches you have, and what species you have, and how many herring spawn sites are there, and how many great salmon holes or rockfish places, and really try to ground people with a sense of place, really connecting to the shoreline. Then we walked through the vulnerability assessment, providing all the examples, and all the maps were for their local community, and then took some folks through actual adaptation projects that are in all different various stages of development, again, in the local community. So every photo, every map, everything in the presentations for, besides the regional picture in the introduction, is places that these folks recognize, know, and love. So it's not only, we get in trouble up here if we use a picture that's not from San Juan County, but this is actually even drilled down to that where it's from their specific island. We had 39 residents participate in the half-day workshop, 2/3 of which were shoreline property owners, and there's about 200 adults that live on Shaw year-round, so we have about 25% of the population. And next I'm just going to sort of slide through some of the results. All of these results are, again, available online. We asked a lot more questions in the intro. We did much more sort of icebreaker questions with how long have you lived on Shaw, do you own shoreline property, highlighting kind of places or species that were particularly important to people. And we used the live response sort of clicker voting. I don't know if people have used those in meetings, but they are a great tool for having people, for one, getting to be anonymous. So you get to see what people really think because you just push your little button and all the results get collated for the room and go up on the screen live for folks. So you don't have the issue of individuals dominating the conversation and some people being shy to raise their hand. And you also, people feel heard because you've documented their results here like right away. And it's new information that they're getting to see live. So it's a great tool. We got a lot of positive feedback from it. We'll probably need to, you can always refine your questions and things like that. But for now, I'll just sort of roll through some of our results. Again, this is just a subset of the questions. So we asked what impact of sea level rise most concerns you. The majority, so 1/3, were most concerned about public infrastructure. Excuse me. Nobody likes to be limited to one answer, so we asked people about additional impacts of sea level rise that concern them. We have an overwhelming response about habitat for fish and wildlife. Our next question focused on responses, adaptation. What do they want to see in terms of public infrastructure? Excuse me. Some of these are pretty interesting because right now in San Juan County, the way that we manage shoreline roads is that if they're failing, we take out a load of rock and sort of throw it off the edge in terms of an emergency or repair or maintenance. There is no work being done to think about where these roads might go or alternatives, thinking about how we deal with sea level rise. So this is just one example of how I think some of this information of what the public actually wants and what managers are providing can be really useful as we feed back to managers. Again, looking at not cost, but factor to consider when managing public infrastructure. Folks don't want the least cost. They want the most permanent and long-term. Again, we were surprised to see some of this more focus on habitat than on recreation. Some of that might be the community that we did this in, so we are trying to do this more broadly across the islands. Excuse me, losing my voice. Switching to the protection of private development, looking at who should pay. Again, I think it's pretty funny because the thing that we are relying on, which is disaster relief nationally, got no response, very similar to the approach we're doing with infrastructure, had the least amount of support. Again, this can, I think, help build support for some action at the government levels. And again, part of this overall rollout was really thinking about how do we communicate this results, and part of it is how do you compel people to either open the document and read more or actually take action. So as part of that, we did some really basic image testing. This is an example of looking at residential development. Which pictures do people like best? I do think it's interesting to note that there will be very important regional differences here. The image C is actually from Lake Washington, from the Green Shore program, from their guide, and that's sort of the good program. And you can see in the San Juans, because we just have such a more rural level of development, that is actually not the look we're going for. And again, we hear over and over that every picture should have a person in it. And, you know, that it's all about people and you shouldn't communicate anything about nature without pictures with people in them. We are getting some mixed feedback with that. Again, that may be this local community. It'll be very interesting. In 2016, we're going to take these meetings more broadly around the rest of the Ferry Services Islands and then hopefully to a couple outer islands and then compile them so we can look at the results by island and then by county. And we've been talking with Northwest Straits Foundation about could we do some of this stuff region-wide or other marine resources committees, because it would be really neat to try to get a picture of the region and see where are there some commonalities, and we could try to push and make some policy changes, and where things might be really different. So kind of wrapping up from all of the sort of new research, outreach with managers, outreach with property owners, kind of if you wanted to drill it down to sort of 3 things that we've kind of learned along the way. One, and I haven't talked much about the on-the-ground adaptation projects, but we have a few where we have public and private landowners interested in advancing either a road relocation or a moving of a house, and we are running into a lot of walls with sort of the existing funding framework, the existing management structure. So salmon recovery projects don't want us to talk about things like road access and safety. And so there's sort of this siloed approach to how we deal with things. And so we're really finding that some sort of different framework, or maybe it's just a new track of funding that's specific for adaptation is going to be needed. But I think, you know, there's going to be some of the big salmon recovery projects left in our county are really climate adaptation projects. They're infrastructure relocations. And if we can't figure out a way to make that work within the salmon recovery framework, then I think we're really missing opportunities. Also, real-life examples. So when we go to we made a lot of these graphics because there's not a lot of pictures of local examples. There's a lot of work happening in the southeast United States right now, but a lot of, you know, building oyster beds and you know, building marsh elevations, and a lot of those examples are really great, but they're also very regionally specific. So finding examples that work in our county and also in the Pacific Northwest and getting some of these case studies on the ground so we can learn from them, but also share. And one of the things that we found in a lot of our research on communication is, you know, we always talk about with people, you want to be the alternative, do an alternative to bulkhead. Well, people don't want to be out at the bleeding edge. They don't want to be different. Our shoreline property owners are white, male, old, and wealthy. They want to be doing what their neighbors are doing. They want to be doing the norm. So really, a lot of this with our communication strategy is thinking about how do we kind of transform our restoration cultivation work and our sea level rise adaptation to really talk about building sort of a norm for a social norm for healthy shorelines. So that you don't ask people to be at the edge and out there alone. And to do that, we're going to need some more case studies. We've got to build that pool of people that are involved. And we're going to need public pressure to get politicians, governments, agencies, again, changing some of these formats is going to take some of these vulnerable communities to kind of stand up and talk about what they want. And that's where that feedback loop from talking with landowners, getting back to managers, we think is going to be an essential part of the mix. So where are we going next? I already talked about we're going to do additional workshops and surveys. We have some interest in specific adaptations. So we've got, you know, folks interested in potentially moving a house back from a feeder bluff instead of armoring. It's also a smelt spawning site. We're doing some cost-benefit analysis for that as kind of a phase 1. Got people interested in moving a house back from a low-lying sort of barrier beach marsh system. Again, looking at some cost-benefit analysis at this phase, hopefully getting some of those to actually be some of our new case studies. Working with the county on some of these larger road relocation, reconfiguration, adaptation projects. And then annual King Tides events. It's something when we had our workshop with conservation entities that people were really excited about, and we're just kind of continuing to ramp that up every year. So I want to thank everybody for your time. I do appreciate the opportunity. I encourage folks to just pick up the phone. We did not put our phone numbers on here for all the spam, but you can find us online. The vast majority of this work is at that website in project reports. The landowner outreach is not there yet, and the geodatabase isn't there yet, but they'll be there soon. And just get in touch with us, and we would love to learn, you know, from other related work that people are doing about how we can learn from them and help us expand the reach of what we're doing, both locally and across the region. So thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.